Again, the Minimoog is often described as such a simple synthesizer, and I think the people who are saying that are people who don't understand the modulation structure. Because due to the way that the Minimoog is arranged in regard to modulation, it is capable of not only traditional modulations, low frequency oscillator modulations, but also audio range oscillations, resulting in a very, very complex sound, just like a complex oscillator is capable of. So let us dig into the rarely described and definitely important modulation section found on the Moog Minimoog.
Okay, here's what we're going to talk about now. We are going to talk about modulation, because the Minimoog is eminently capable of modulation. And this is not the thing you think about most when you're thinking about the Minimoog, but it does exist, and it's important. So, you'll notice there's an oscillator modulation switch, a filter modulation switch, modulation mix, and then there is a mod wheel. So all of these things, there's no way you would necessarily know they were all necessarily connected, but they are. And it becomes really interesting. You'll notice, okay, in the modulation mix, it says oscillator 3 or noise. These are our two sources of modulation that exist in the Minimoog. And when it's set to oscillator 3 is our LFO. And the way we put it into traditional LFO mode is we turn off oscillator 3 control. What oscillator 3 control is the degree to which the keyboard controls the frequency of oscillator 3. LFOs typically are set at a specific frequency, so we don't want the keys changing the frequency every time we play a note. So if you want to use oscillator 3 as an LFO, you turn off this switch. Now oscillator 3 is static. If we want a low frequency oscillator 2, we're going to need to turn it off from being a audio range frequency oscillator, and we do that by going to low. This is the situation where low becomes useful for one of our oscillators. So now we have to tell the Minimoog where we want the modulation generated by the third oscillator. Where do we want that to go? Let's start by turning on oscillator modulation, that switch. Now we're saying to the Minimoog, okay, oscillator 3 is a voltage source that's fluctuating slower than audio range. The amount is controlled by the wheel. The mix is controlled by this knob. It's all the way to oscillator 3. And now we've said, so when the wheel goes up, it's going to apply oscillator 3 to the frequency of the other two oscillators. And that is how we get LFO on the Minimoog. We sacrifice an oscillator. And I know a lot of people will be like, oh, I don't want to sacrifice an oscillator. But honestly, most of the great Minimoog parts that you've heard in songs and etc., they're often one oscillator, especially if they're a bass. Piling three oscillators atop each other is a cool effect, but it's not what you want all the time. So it's okay to sacrifice one so that it can be the LFO. And of course, you get to have different LFO waves because your oscillator has different waves. We have on oscillator 3, there are two different waveforms, and they are both sawtooth waves, but they're flipped. And while that flip isn't necessarily audible to the ear, I didn't even play it in the oscillator section, when you have it going this slow, what the voltage change is very obvious to the ear, as we just heard. One's a saw, the other's a ramp. And that's why we can get that pulse width modulation sound when we mix the ramp saw with the saw from another oscillator. I don't think I demonstrated that. I'll have to remember to do that. Okay. The different square shapes, pulse shapes really, give you a different timing for when the modulation returns goes up and down, which is interesting because, most LFOs aren't set up like this where it's an oscillator that's being changed. And of course, keep in mind, like you can change the frequency. So if it's not fast or slow enough for you, when you're in slow mode, you actually have a fine-tuned frequency in the typical oscillator tuning knob. And that is super cool, but we also have to keep in mind that there is magic here. And that magic is we can set this into the audio range. It doesn't have to be a low frequency oscillator. It can be a high frequency oscillator. And then we can apply it. Let's put it on the lowest setting. We can apply a actual audio range frequency modulation to oscillators 1 and 2. Let's listen. And then you can fine tune where you want it. And of course, it's going to change with different wave shapes. And then if you really want to get weird, you can turn control back on, and now this oscillator is going to act as a modulation source and a typical oscillator. Now your modulation speed is going to change with the key that you play. And when people talk about the Minimoog, they're always like, oh, it's so simple. And that's because they must not know that you're capable of doing complex oscillator output with this instrument. Once you go into the audio range, you're capable of creating some very complex wave shapes. And that is awesome. Let's keep in mind also that we could turn this off and then we could use noise as the modulation. Keep in mind what you have noise set to makes a difference. You can get a pink noise modulation like this, or a white noise modulation. There isn't a huge difference, but it does make a difference. Okay, so that is what happens when we use the modulation structure to modulate the oscillator. Let's have a listen to what happens when we use it to modulate the filter, which is also possible. We can put it back down in LFO and have it not be controlled by the keyboard. We'll turn off the contour, so now it's just the modulation coming from oscillator 3. So, and that's very useful. Once again, it's always nice to be able to modulate your filter with an LFO. We love that. You can also turn on the control. Now the speed of the modulation will vary with the voltage of the oscillator as provided by the keys. Which is a fun thing you didn't really see on a lot of synthesizers in the 70s. It's a really unique outcome that has a lot of expressive possibility, and no one did it. let's also keep in mind that we can switch right into the audio range. And this is one of the things that makes a filter fat is saturation, distortion. And so you can modulate the filter with Oscillator 3 in audio mode. How often do you hear like sounds like that and everyone like, oh, it's a Minimoog, you know, like you don't hear sounds like this because a lot of people don't take advantage of this functionality. I can think of an ELO song that has that in it. Kiyama, man. Again, oh, the Minimoog's so simple. It just does simple sounds. No, it doesn't. Anyway, so yes, you can, and the possibilities are just so endless. You get these very big, weird, organic sounds that are delicious and wonderful. And once again, this is the Minimoog. This is what it sounds like. This is what you get, you know? If you're not making use of the modulation section of the Minimoog, you're missing out, because that's where all of the complex, beautiful, rich, gorgeous, saturated sounds that the Minimoog is capable of come from. And that is the modulation section. Somehow ignored, but found on the 50-year-old Minimoog.